There are people alive today who never once heard their parents say, "I love you." Yet they felt it in every meal placed silently on the table. They felt it in a coat laid out the night before winter. They felt it in a father who worked double shifts without a single complaint. This was the 1970s, and the love was real. It was just never spoken out loud. There is a generation walking among us right now carrying something that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. These are men and women raised in a world with no participation trophies, no therapeutic language, and no emotional safety nets. They were simply expected to grow, and most of them did, in ways that are quietly staggering when you look closely. This video explores the psychology behind how they were raised, what that silence actually meant, and what we can learn from a love that never said its own name. Most people assume that emotional withholding is the same as emotional absence, that if a parent never said the words, the child must have felt unloved, disconnected, or psychologically damaged. That is a comfortable modern assumption, but it is almost entirely wrong. The science tells a more complicated and more fascinating story than that simple narrative allows. Imagine a boy, 10 years old, waking before sunrise in a house that smells of coffee and engine grease. His father is already at the kitchen table, boots on, face unreadable, no hug, no words, just a nod. And the boy knows, somehow deeply, that this nod means everything is fine. That nod was the whole language. It was safety coded in silence, delivered through presence rather than proclamation. That boy grew up reading rooms before he read books. He learned to decode the shift in a voice before the sentence was finished. He noticed when someone's jaw tightened even though their words stayed calm. These were not skills he was taught. They were skills forged in an environment where emotion was not announced but performed through action, consistency, and sacrifice. That is not trauma. That is a different kind of school. Psychologists call this the distinction between expressive and instrumental love. Dr. Gary Chapman later formalized a version of this concept in his work on love languages, but the psychological groundwork had been laid decades earlier. Studies in developmental psychology found that children raised with high behavioral consistency, even in emotionally reserved homes, showed strong attachment security when physical needs and presence were reliable. The words were often missing. The reliability was not. What those 1970s children developed as a result was something researchers now call environmental attunement. Because they could not rely on verbal cues, they sharpened their observational skills instead. They became extraordinarily good at reading tension, anticipating needs, and calibrating their behavior to unspoken expectations. These are not small skills. These are the exact capacities that separate excellent leaders from average ones in nearly every professional domain. By the age of 8 or 9, many children of this era were managing household responsibilities that would be considered extraordinary by today's standards. Coming home to an empty house was not a crisis. It was Tuesday. You made a sandwich, you did your homework, you started dinner if you knew how. There was no app to check in with, no parent texting to confirm your arrival. You figured it out. And figuring it out, repeatedly, built something that cannot be downloaded. Psychologist Albert Bandura's research on self-efficacy maps almost perfectly onto this experience. Self-efficacy is not confidence in the general sense. It is the specific belief that you are capable of executing the actions required to produce a desired outcome. Children who regularly solved their own problems, managed their own time, and navigated their own small emergencies developed extraordinarily high self-efficacy before adolescence. That is a psychological resource that compounds over a lifetime. There was no streaming service. There were 3 television channels and a bedtime. Between the end of school and the beginning of dinner, there stretched a vast, unstructured, magnificent wilderness of boredom. And boredom, neuroscientists now tell us, is one of the most generative mental states a developing brain can experience. The default mode network activates. Creativity ignites. The self begins to form its own shape. Those children invented games from sticks and bottle caps. They built worlds in empty lots. They argued about rules and negotiated territories, and sometimes came home bloody from the consequences of their own bad decisions. Every single one of those experiences deposited something into an internal bank that funded decades of problem-solving later. The tolerance for discomfort they built then is a resource many people spend thousands of dollars in therapy trying to rebuild now. Risk was not managed in the 1970s. It was encountered, Children climbed trees without anyone calculating the full radius. They rode bikes without helmets, to destinations no adult had pre-approved. They ate things off the ground with a 3-second rule that was more custom than science. And yes, sometimes they got hurt. But getting hurt and surviving more specifically, discovering that you could survive rewired the nervous system in a profound way. Neuroscientists studying resilience have found that moderate, recoverable stress in childhood builds what is called stress inoculation. The body learns that alarm is not catastrophe. The mind learns that pain ends. Children who experienced this kind of graduated physical risk grew into adults who could tolerate uncertainty, sit with discomfort, and take calculated risks without emotional paralysis. The scrapped knee was not just a scrape, it was a lesson about what the body could handle. One of the most undervalued gifts of that era was solitude without electronics. When there was nothing to do and no one to entertain you and silence stretched wide and long, a child was left alone with themselves in a way that modern children almost never experience. And something important happens in that silence. The self learns to be its own company. Thoughts are examined, feelings are sat with instead of scrolled past. An interior life is assembled, quietly, without any user manual. Psychologist Esther Buchholz argued in her research that alone time is not the opposite of connection, but its necessary counterpart. Children who experience solitude regularly, not as punishment, but as simple circumstance, developed what she called a capacity for productive inner life. They became people who could sit on a long flight without anxiety, work alone without restlessness, and process difficult emotions without immediately reaching for distraction. That is an increasingly rare and increasingly valuable capability. Emotions in the 1970s household were rarely discussed out loud. You did not process your feelings at the dinner table. If something upset you, you went to your room. You felt it. And then, eventually, you came back out. This sounds like suppression, and sometimes it was, but often it was something more nuanced. It was the development of a regulatory capacity, the ability to feel an emotion without being consumed by it, to let it move through without turning it into a defining event. Psychologist James Gross at Stanford has spent decades studying emotion regulation and found that individuals who learn to process emotions internally, rather than always seeking external validation, show greater emotional stability over time. This does not mean silence is always healthy, but it does mean that the enforced internal processing of a generation raised to handle their own feelings produced, in many cases, adults with remarkable emotional steadiness under pressure. They had been practicing emotional regulation since childhood without ever calling it that. Delayed gratification was simply the structure of life. You wanted something for Christmas in October, and you waited. You saved your allowance for months because the thing you wanted cost more than a week's supply. There was no one-click purchasing, no overnight delivery, no instant access to anything. The waiting was not incidental. The waiting was the lesson. You learned that desire did not require immediate satisfaction to remain meaningful. You learned that the future was real and worth planning for. The famous Stanford marshmallow experiment and its many follow-ups found strong correlations between a child's ability to delay gratification and later outcomes in education, health, and professional success. But what often gets overlooked in the popular discussion of that research is the role environment plays in building that capacity. Children raised in reliable environments where promises were kept, where waiting actually produced results, learned to delay gratification naturally. The 1970s household, whatever its emotional limitations, was frequently a masterclass in reliable structure. Failure in that era was not cushioned. You got a bad grade, you dealt with it. You lost the game, you shook hands and went home. No one called the coach. No one rewrote the grade. You simply lived with the result and figured out what to do next. This sounds harsh, and occasionally it was, but the psychological consequence of repeated, unprotected failure experiences is the development of what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, the internalized belief that failure is information, not identity. Adults raised in this tradition tend to display something striking in professional settings. They do not collapse under criticism. They do not require excessive reassurance. They update their understanding of a situation based on evidence and move forward. These are not small professional advantages. These are the traits that distinguish functional teams from dysfunctional ones, and effective leaders from reactive ones. Failure, experienced early and survived cleanly, becomes a tool rather than a threat. The social intelligence that emerged from 1970s childhoods was distinctly analog and deeply practical. You learned to read a room because no one told you what the room was feeling. You learned to navigate conflict because adults did not always step in to manage it for you. You learned to earn your place in a group, to understand hierarchy, to recognize when someone was near their limit before they said so. These were survival skills dressed up as social skills. Research in social neuroscience consistently finds that humans develop social intelligence not from instruction but from repeated real-world interaction with natural consequences. The children of the 1970s were immersed in that environment continuously. They negotiated, argued, collaborated, and fell out with each other across long, unstructured days. Every one of those interactions was a data point, their developing brain catalogued and used to build an increasingly sophisticated model of how human beings actually work. Here is why all of this matters right now. We live in an era of extraordinary comfort and extraordinary fragility. We have built systems designed to minimize every discomfort, and in doing so we have accidentally undermined the very experiences that build psychological strength. The generation raised in those quiet, demanding, unsentimental 1970s households did not have optimal childhoods by modern therapeutic standards, but they developed a set of capacities that the modern world increasingly cannot replicate and desperately needs. The silence that surrounded that generation's upbringing was not a wound, at least not entirely. It was also a forge. The absence of constant verbal affirmation forced them to develop internal sources of self-worth. The absence of constant stimulation forced them to develop internal sources of interest and meaning. The absence of constant intervention forced them to develop internal sources of problem-solving capability. Internal, internal, internal. That is the through line. That is the gift wrapped in hardship. Consider this. The next time you feel anxious because a task is difficult, or because no one has validated your effort yet, or because the outcome is uncertain and the waiting feels unbearable, consider what it means that an entire generation navigated their whole childhood with all of those conditions as the permanent baseline. They did not call it resilience. They did not know they were building anything. They were just living, and they came out capable of a kind of endurance that deserves our genuine respect and careful study. The love in those 1970s homes was not absent. It was architectural. It was built into the structure of every packed lunch, every lawn that got mowed without being asked, every light left on when someone was coming home late. It did not announce itself. It simply held things together, and perhaps the deepest lesson of that whole generation, the thing that quietly echoes through everything they built and survived and became, is that love does not always need a voice to change everything it touches.